Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be making this hill here with a nice dramatic cliffside to it. This is going to be the base for a Dark Age watchtower that I'm working on for my Dux Britanniarum campaign, but it was pretty involved and I haven't actually yet done a tutorial on how to just make a conventional hill using rock mold, Sculptamold, and plaster cloth, things of that nature. So I thought it would be nice to break up the tutorial. Here I'll be showing you just how I created this hill, and then in my next video I'll show how I created the watchtower. So sit back and relax, and hopefully I'll show you how to make a pretty realistic looking hillside. So the first thing we are going to do is create the basic structure, the basic shape of the hill, using here some insulation foam. I'm going to try and do as little cutting as possible. I just want to get a basic shape. I'll be using Sculptamold and plaster cloth to really nail down the exact shape that I want for my hill. And here too, I'm just getting a nice slope to the side of my hill. That's going to be kind of the path running up the middle of this cliffside. And I'm testing out the slope with a figure here on a 20mm base. I want to make sure that the hill is not too steep for, my figures when I'm trying to play a game with them. If they're continually falling over, that won't do me much good. So as I'm carving and cutting this foam, I will go back and continually ensure that that model is able to stand on really any part of the slope that I need it to. And once I'm happy with the basic shape of my hill, I just put a shish kebab skewer in there and cut it off and added some PVA glue around the sides, and that will help hold the hill together as I work on it. Next, I'm going to be placing my hill on a piece of chipboard. I've become a big fan of using chipboard for my terrain bases as long as it's not more than 12 inches by 12 inches. If you go over that size, you might run into some warping issues with the chipboard. But for smaller terrain pieces, it's really nice because it's a really thin base. It's about 1/8 of an inch. It's really hard to find MDF that is that thin. And so it's really easy to get a really sleek profile to the base of your terrain using chipboard. So I'd highly recommend using it if you can find it in your local hardware store. So now we need to make some rocks for our cliffside. So here I'm using Woodland Scenic's plaster molds, and I'm just using regular plaster of Paris. And I'm going to be filling these up and then letting them dry for about 45 minutes, and they'll be ready to use. Once I have a pretty wide selection of different looking rock faces, I'm going to take some celluclay, which is basically a knockoff on Sculptamold. If you're having trouble finding Sculptamold, celluclay is the same thing, and it's actually a little cheaper. So I'm just putting this celluclay, which is a paper mache material, up against the foam, and I'm using that to adhere these rock molds on there. And it does a great job. I like doing this rather than using super glue or PVA, because once you stick the rock in there, you can kind of shape the celluclay around the rock, let it blend in more naturally into the foam behind it. One thing to note about this celluclay product is I do think, at least in my opinion, that it takes longer to dry than Sculptamold. So you do have to plan to let this sit for maybe up to a day to completely dry. And about an hour after applying the celluclay, I'll even go back as it's starting its curing process and smooth out all the areas where I put the celluclay down, just to make sure I got a nice smooth texture to my hill. Now, if you run into areas on your hill where there's a sizable gap between the rock mold and the insulation foam, what I do is I just take a little bit of newspaper or rolled up paper, and I take some of that plaster cloth and I'll cover up the newspaper with that, add a little bit of sculpting mold, and boom, you just patched up any holes that you might have had in your terrain. It's a really nice technique, and it allows you to be a little less exact with your foam cutting. And once I have the rock faces in place and the basic silhouette of my hill done, I'm taking a layer of plaster cloth by Woodland Scenics and covering up that celluclay. Plaster cloth is a very durable substance, and I always like to add it after I get that initial shape, just again to help protect the terrain. Now at the bottom of the cliff face, I'm going to be adding some broken rocks, which are actually just pieces of leftover plaster that I've had from the molding process. I break those into little pieces, place them at the bottom to make it look like fallen rock. Then just to add a little bit of texture and smaller grit to the fallen rock, I take some sand mixed with some aquarium rocks and I'll sprinkle that over after I lay down a layer of PVA glue. And now that the hill is dried, I'm going to start painting the earth tones on the hill. So I take here a burnt umber brown color and I mix it in with some liquitex textured paint. It has little grains of sand mixed in. And I'm going to be applying this to most of the areas that, of course, are not the rock faces. That brown paint has dried, I'm actually going with a burnt sienna ink, dark brown ink, and going back over the areas that I just painted that earth color, as I found that some of the white was still showing through from the plaster. So this will be a nice second coat to give that nice dark brown base color for our dirt. So now we're going to start painting the rock faces of my cliff. So I have a bunch of different gray colors. I'm just going to be placing them and mixing them all together on these rock faces. When you look at a rock, they're not just one color gray, they have actually quite a variation in color. So this will help simulate that. And once the paint dries, we're going to go over it with a black wash. This will help bring out any of the micro details on the rock faces. Now while that wash dries, I'm going to start dry brushing all the earth tones to get our first highlight layer. So here I've taken a kind of mid-tone earth brown by Vallejo, and I'm using a makeup brush and just lightly dusting over all those brown areas. And for the final highlight for my earth color here, I'm taking a buff titanium, which is an off-white, and I'm really lightly going over all the areas of earth on the hill. So now we're going to start dry brushing the rock faces, and here I took a warm gray, and I'm going to be sure to go over most of the rock faces, even here doing kind of horizontal swipes to catch most of the details. And now we're going to go over it with some buff titanium, again an off-white. And here I'm only going to lightly touch the rocks, doing a lot of vertical sweeps, only touching the areas I know that will be catching the most light. So now we're going to start adding the static grass and foliage to the hill. And here I have some Nock 12mm grass, and I haven't actually used this before, and I don't think it turned out all that great. As I was going over it, I went over it maybe 3 or 4 times, and I still didn't feel like I was getting very good or thick coverage with this grass. I think this would be better making small tufts of it and then gluing it down. I don't think using a wide dispersion of the static grass, especially on a hill where it's hard to get the applicator close, did that great of a job. So I'll have to be going over it with a smaller length static grass to kind of fill in the areas that are a little too sparse. So now I'm going to add some 6mm grass to the hill, and I'm going over to the areas next to where I placed the 12mm, and I'm also actually going over the 12mm grass just to help fill in those sparse areas where I didn't get a lot of grass coverage. And now I'm going to add some pre-made tufts to my hill. These are tufts that are a little bit different. I've added either colored flock to make it look like flowers, or I've added some of the super leaf material from Scenic Express just to make it look like different kinds of flowering plants and weeds. Now I let the static grass dry for a little bit, and I'm going back over it here first with some isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension, and then I'm adding some scenic glue to all the areas of my static grass. And now I'm going back over it with some actually 2mm kind of burnt yellow grass. I felt that my hill was a little too bright green. This will tone down the color and help fill in any areas that the larger static grasses left too sparse. Then I'm going in with a sculpting tool and making sure the grass is all laying in the direction that I want it to. We'll add a little bit more scenic glue to my static grass here, and now we're going to add in a bunch of different flocks. So first we're going to start with my favorite flock, which is the Burnt Grass Color by Woodland Scenics. It's this nice kind of yellowish brown flock, and I'm going to add that all over just to give some texture to the static grass, look like weeds are growing among the grass, things like that. And so now we're going to add some coarse flock to the hill here. These look like little bushes or bigger pieces of weeds that are growing. And I'm putting this in areas where, again, the flock is sparse, or in some areas where I left some of the dirt exposed. And this, again, will do a nice job of breaking up the silhouette of the grass. Now I'm coming in with some yellow flock and sprinkling it over some areas of the static grass just to simulate flowers like wild mustard or something that might be growing on the hill. And then I am taking some of the super leaf material from Scenic Express and sprinkling it over certain areas of the grass, again to look like little weeds growing up among the grass. And here I'm just adding another darker tone of that super leaf material. Now I'm adding some fine yellow leaf flock as the final highlight to this grass section. For the final step, I'm creating our path up to our watchtower by just taking some fine terrarium sand, mixing it in with some different colors of grout, and I'm just going to sprinkle it down to the middle area of the hill. And there we have it, our completed hill. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. I really don't think you can beat using plaster molds for rocks. I know a lot of people like carving foam, but I always feel like it looks pretty unrealistic. And even using cork bark, which is something I advocated in the past, I just don't think it gives as nice of an appearance as using these Woodland Scenics molds. And they're really easy to use and apply, especially if you're using sculpted mold or celluclay. Anyway, I really enjoyed this, and I think I might be making a few more hills in the future. And I actually decided to keep this as a separate terrain piece from my watchtower after making this. I just made sure to have a little flat spot up at the top where I can set it. But I think I want to use it for a broader spectrum of games, not just for my Dark Age army. And before you go, really quickly, I just want to let you know that I have started a Patreon for this channel. I actually started it a few months ago, but then the pandemic hit and I felt really weird about promoting my Patreon. But I feel like, you know what, let's go ahead and throw it out there for those of you who really care about the channel. I'll give you an ability to support it, and I'm not going to put any of my content behind a paywall. All my tutorials will always be free. The channel will just be, again, there to allow me to get some newer camera equipment and maybe get some more expensive terrain pieces that I can make tutorials for. And every cent that I get from the Patreon, I'm just going to put it right back into the channel. So there you go. This is the last time and probably the only time I'm ever going to talk about my Patreon in a video, but you can find the link down below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment. All those things help my channel. And I will see you guys soon with a new video. Take care.